extension or refunding of the bond maturity. However, traffic density data in private hands in 1939 indicated that this mileage was not a valuable part of the Southern Railway system. 3. Possible payment on grounds of convenience, etc. If the Southern Railway is prosperous in 1946, it may take care of this maturity merely to avoid insolvency for part of the system. There is also the technical possibility that by the terms of its own blanket development and general mortgage, under which sufficient bonds are reserved to refund the Georgia Midland Threes at maturity, it may be considered to have an obligation to provide for payment of these bonds in 1946. Here also, as in the two previous paragraphs, the bondholder in 1939 could not be too confident of the strength of his position. The foregoing discussion will perhaps adequately explain the low price of the Georgia Midland Threes at the beginning of 1939. It is interesting to note, as an element of security analysis, that the key fact in this situation, the unprofitable character of the mileage covered, was not a matter of public record, but required a check into supplementary sources of information. Guaranteed issues frequently undervalued. The tobacco products example illustrates the fairly frequent undervaluation of guaranteed or quasi-guaranteed issues as compared with other securities of the guarantor enterprise. A well-known instance was that of San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railway Company First Fours, due 1943, guaranteed as to principal and interest by Southern Pacific Company. Although these enjoyed a mortgage security in addition to the guarantee, they regularly sold at prices yielding higher returns than did the unsecured obligations of the Southern Pacific. Examples. A more striking contrast was afforded by the price of Barnhart Brothers and Spindler Company First and Second Preferred, both guaranteed as to principal and dividends by American Type Founders Company, in relation to the price of the guarantor's own preferred stock, which was not a fixed obligation. Additional examples of this point are afforded by the price of Hewlers of Delaware Inc. Preferred, guaranteed by Schulte Retail Stores Corporation, as compared with the price of Schulte Preferred, and by the price of Armour and Company of Delaware Guaranteed Preferred, as compared with the preferred stock of the guarantor company, Armour and Company of Illinois. Some comparative quotations relating to these examples may be found in the accompanying PDF. It is obvious that in cases of this sort, advantageous exchanges can be made from the lower yielding into the higher yielding security with no impairment of safety, or else into a much better secured issue with little sacrifice of yield, and sometimes with an actual gain. Inclusion of guarantees and rentals in the calculation of fixed charges. All obligations equivalent to bond interest should be included with the company's interest charges when calculating the coverage for its bond issues. This point has already been explained in some detail in connection with railroad fixed charges, and it was touched upon briefly in our discussion of public utility bonds. The procedure in these groups offers no special difficulties. But in the case of certain types of industrial companies, the treatment of rentals and guarantees may offer confusing variations. This question is of particular moment in connection with retail enterprises, theater companies, etc., in which rent or other obligations related to buildings occupied may be an important element in the general picture. Such a building may be owned by the corporation and paid for by a bond issue, in which case the obligation will be fully disclosed in both the balance sheet and the income account. But if another company occupies a similar building under long-term lease, no separate measure of the rental obligation appears in the income account, and no indication thereof can be found in the balance sheet. The second company may appear sounder than the first, but that is only because its obligations are undisclosed. Essentially, both companies are carrying a similar burden. Conversely, the outright ownership of premises free and clear carries an important advantage, from the standpoint of preferred stock particularly, over operation under long-term lease, although the capitalization setup will not reveal this advantage. Examples. If Interstate Department Stores Preferred had been compared with the Outlet Company Preferred in 1929, the two exhibits might have appeared closely similar. The earnings coverage averaged about the same, and neither company showed any bond or mortgage liability. But Outlet's position was in actuality by far the stronger because it owned its land and buildings, while those of Interstate, with a minor exception, were held under lease. The real effect of this situation was to place a substantial fixed obligation ahead of Interstate Department Stores Preferred, which did not exist in the case of Outlet. In the chain store field, a similar observation would apply to a comparison of J.C. Penney Preferred and S.H. Crest Preferred in 1932, for the latter company owned more than half of its store properties, while nearly all the Penney locations were leased. Lease liabilities generally overlooked. The question of liability under long-term leases received very little attention from the financial world until its significance was brought home rudely in 1931 and 1932, when the high level of rentals assumed in the preceding boom years proved intolerably burdensome to many merchandising companies. Example: the influence of this factor upon a supposed investment security is shown with striking force in the case of United Cigar Stores Preferred. This issue and its predecessor had for many years shown every sign of stability and had sold accordingly at a consistently high level. For 1928, the company reported no funded debt and earnings equal to about 7 times the preferred dividend. Yet so crushing were the liabilities under its long-term leases and to carry properties acquired by subsidiaries that in 1932 bankruptcy was resorted to, and the preferred stock was menaced with extinction. Such liabilities complicated analysis. It must be admitted that in the case of companies where the rental factor is important, its obtrusion has badly complicated the whole question of bond or preferred stock analysis. Fortunately, the investor now has some data as to the extent of such leasehold obligations, since they are now required to be summarized in registration statements filed with the SEC, and the actual rent payments must be stated each year on Form 10-K. But the problem remains whether or not these rentals should be treated, in whole or in part, as the equivalent of fixed charges. To some extent, certainly, they are identical, rather with fixed overhead, for example, depreciation, taxes, general expense, which it has not been found feasible to add in with bond interest for the purpose of figuring a margin of safety. One type of solution is obvious. If the company meets the earnings test, even after adding rents paid to bond interest, the rent situation need not worry the investor. We feel, however, that it would be neither fair nor practicable to require every company to meet a test so severe. A compromise suggestion based on some study of actual exhibits may be hazarded, viz., 1. that 1/3 the annual rentals for building space be included with fixed charges and preferred dividends to compute the earnings coverage, and 2. that in the case of retail establishments, chain stores, department stores, the minimum coverage required for interest plus 1/3 of rentals be reduced from 3 to 2. This reduction would recognize the relative stability of retail business after allowance is made for the special burden attaching to the rental factor. The corresponding coverage required for a retail company's preferred stock would be reduced from 4 to 2.5. Examples for Lowe's, Inc., McCrory Stores Corp., and McClellan Stores Company may be found in the accompanying PDF. Conclusions: Lowe's 3.5s pass our quantitative test for non-retail bond issues. McClellan Preferred does, but McCrory Preferred does not pass our suggested test for retail store preferred stocks. The 4 preceding examples illustrate a simplified technique for earnings coverage. Instead of first computing the amount available for the charges, we divide the charges and preferred dividends into the balance after charges and preferred dividends and add 1 to the quotient. The reader is warned that these suggested standards and the calculations illustrating them are submitted with considerable hesitation. They represent a new departure in analytical method. The data for rentals paid are available only at some effort. Most serious of all, the arithmetical standards proposed are arbitrary and perhaps not the best that can be devised. We might point out further that the new test may yield some unexpected results. Note that McClellan Preferred has sold in 1939 at a lower price than McCrory Preferred, a point that may be justified by other factors. Note further that if the same calculation as above is applied to W.T. Grant 5% Preferred, a high-priced issue, which earned its dividend nearly 10 times over in 1934 to 1938, we should find that the preferred dividend plus 1/3 of rentals was covered not quite 2.5 times. Status of guaranteed obligations. Some additional observations may properly be made as to the computation of earnings coverage in the case of guaranteed obligations. In the typical case, the properties involved in the guarantee form part of the whole enterprise. Hence, both the earnings therefrom and the guaranteed payments are included in a single income statement. Example: Neisner Realty Corporation 6s due 1948 are guaranteed by Neisner Brothers, Inc. The corporation's operations and interest charges are included in the parent company's consolidated statement. When the guaranteed security is outstanding against a separately operated property, its standing may depend either on its own results or on those of the guarantor. Hence, the issue need be required to pass only one of three alternative tests based on 1. Earnings of issuing company independent of the guarantee, or 2. Combined earnings and charges of the issuing and guarantor companies, or 3. Earnings of guarantor company applied to its own charges plus its guarantees. Examples: A. Indiana Harbor Belt Railway General 4s and 4.5s due 1957, guaranteed as to principal and interest by New York Central Railroad and an important subsidiary. The Standard Statistics Bond Guide gives as the interest coverage that of the guarantor the New York Central System. But the showing of the company itself is much better and may be found in the accompanying PDF. B. This is the typical situation in which coverage is calculated from a consolidated income account, including operations of both the parent guarantor company and its guaranteed subsidiaries. C. Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Sault Ste. Marie 5.5s due 1978, guaranteed as to interest by Canadian Pacific Railway. The Sioux line shows earnings of only a small part of total interest charges. Coverage for this issue might best be computed by applying earnings of Canadian Pacific Railway to the total of its own interest charges plus the guaranteed interest on these and other bonds guaranteed by Canadian Pacific Railway. Subsidiary company bonds. The bonds of a subsidiary of a strong company are generally regarded as well protected on the theory that the parent company will take care of all its constituents' obligations. This viewpoint is encouraged by the common method of setting up consolidated income accounts under which all the subsidiary bond interest appears as a charge against all the combined earnings, ranking ahead of the parent company's preferred and common stocks. If, however, the parent concern is not contractually responsible for the subsidiary bonds by guarantee or lease or direct assumption, this form of statement may prove to be misleading. For if a particular subsidiary proves unprofitable, its bond interest may conceivably not be taken care of by the parent company, which may be willing to lose its investment in this part of its business and turn it over to the subsidiary's bondholders. Such a development is unusual, but the possibility thereof was forcibly demonstrated in 1932 to 1933 by the History of United Drug Company 5s due 1953. Examples: United Drug was an important subsidiary of Drug, Inc., which had regularly earned and paid large dividends, gained chiefly from the manufacture of proprietary medicines and other drugs. In the first half of 1932, the consolidated income account showed earnings equal to 10 times the interest on United Drug 5s, and the record of previous years was even better. While this issue was not assumed or guaranteed by Drug, Inc., investors considered the combined showing so favorable as to assure the safety of the United Drug Fives beyond question. But United Drug owned, as part of its assets and business, the stock of Louis K. Liggett Company, which operated a large number of drugstores and which was burdened by a high rental problem similar to that of United Cigar Stores. In September 1932, Liggett's notified its landlords that unless rents were reduced, it would be forced into bankruptcy. This announcement brought rudely home to investors the fact that the still prosperous Drug Inc. was not assuming responsibility for the liabilities of its indirect subsidiary, Liggett's, and they immediately became nervously conscious of the fact that Drug Inc. was not responsible for interest payments on United Drug Fives either. Sales of these bonds resulting from this discovery depressed the price from 93 earlier in the year down to 42. At the latter figure, the $40 million of United Drug Fives were quoted at only $17 million, although the parent company's stock was still selling for more than $100 million, 3,500,000 shares at about 30. In the following year, the Drug Inc. system was voluntarily dissolved into its component parts, an unusual development, and the United Drug Company resumed its entirely separate existence. It has since shown an inadequate coverage for the 5% bonds. Consolidated Traction Company of New Jersey First Fives were obligations of a large but unprofitable subsidiary of Public Service Corporation of New Jersey. The bonds were not guaranteed by the parent company. When they matured in 1933, many of the holders accepted an offer of $65 for their bonds made by the parent company. Saltex Looms, Inc., First Sixes, due 1954, were obligations of a subsidiary of Sidney Blumenthal and Company, Inc., but in no way guaranteed by the parent company. The consolidated earnings statements of Blumenthal regularly deducted the Saltex bond interest before showing the amount available for its own preferred stock. Interest on the bonds was defaulted, however, in 1939, and in 1940 the bonds sold at 7, while Blumenthal Preferred was quoted above 70. Separate analysis of subsidiary interest coverage essential. These examples suggest that just as investors are prone to underestimate the value of a guarantee by a strong company, they sometimes make the opposite mistake and attach undue significance to the fact that a company is controlled by another. From the standpoint of fixed value investment, nothing of importance may be taken for granted. Hence, a subsidiary bond should not be purchased on the basis of the showing of its parent company unless the latter has assumed direct responsibility for the bond in question. In other cases, the exhibit of the subsidiary itself can afford the only basis for the acceptance of its bond issues. In the above discussion, it will be seen that investors in bonds of a holding company must insist upon a consolidated income account, in which the subsidiary interest, whether guaranteed or not, is shown as a prior charge, but that purchasers of unguaranteed subsidiary bonds cannot accept such consolidated reports as a measure of their safety, and must require a statement covering the subsidiary alone. These statements may be obtainable only with some difficulty, as was true in the case of United Drug Fives, but they must nevertheless be insisted upon. Chapter 18. Protective Covenants and Remedies of Senior Security Holders. In this and the two succeeding chapters, we shall consider the provisions usually made to protect the rights of bond owners and preferred stockholders against impairment, and the various lines of actions which may be followed in the event of non-fulfillment of the company's obligations. Our object here, as throughout this book, is not to supply information of a kind readily available elsewhere, but rather to subject current practices to critical examination and to suggest feasible improvements therein for the benefit of security holders generally. In this connection, a review of recent developments in the field of reorganization procedure may also be found of value. Indenture or charter provisions designed to protect holder of senior securities. The contract between a corporation and the owners of its bonds is contained in a document called the indenture or deed of trust. The corresponding agreements relating to the rights of preferred stockholders are set forth in the Articles or Certificate of Incorporation. These instruments usually contain provisions designed to prevent corporate acts injurious to senior security holders and to afford remedies in case of certain unfavorable developments. The more important occurrences for which such provision is almost always made may be listed under the following heads. 1. In the case of bonds. A. Non-payment of interest, principal, or sinking fund. B. Default on other obligations or receivership. C. Issuance of new secured debt. D. Dilution of a conversion or subscription privilege. 2. In the case of preferred stocks. A. Non-payment of cumulative preferred dividends for a period of time. B. Creation of funded debt or prior stock issue. C. Dilution of a conversion or subscription privilege. A frequent but less general provision requires the maintenance of working capital at a certain percentage of the bonded debt of industrial companies. In the case of investment trust or holding company bonds, it is the market value of all the assets which is subject to this provision. The remedies provided for bondholders in cases falling under 1A and 1B above are fairly well standardized. Any one of these untoward developments is designated as an event of default and permits the trustee to declare the principal of the bond issue due and payable in advance of the specified maturity date. The provisions, therefore, in the indenture are known as acceleration clauses. Their purpose, in the main, is to enable the bondholders to assert the full amount of their claim in competition with the other creditors. Contradictory aspects of bondholders' legal rights. In considering these provisions from a critical standpoint, we must recognize that there are contradictory aspects to the question of the bondholders' legal rights. Receivership is a dreaded word in Wall Street. Its advent means ordinarily a drastic shrinkage in the price of all the company's securities, including the bonds for the benefit of which the receivership was instituted. As we pointed out in a former chapter, the market's appraisal of a bond in default is no higher on the whole, and perhaps lower, than that of a non-dividend paying preferred stock of a solvent company. The question arises, therefore, whether the bondholders might not be better off if they did not have any enforceable claim to principal or interest payments when conditions are such as to make prompt payment impossible. For at such times the bondholders' legal rights apparently succeed only in ruining the corporation without benefiting the bondholder. As long as the interest or principal is not going to be paid anyway, would it not be to the interest of the bondholders themselves to postpone the date of payment and keep the enterprise out of the courts? Corporate insolvency and reorganization. This question leads into the broad field of corporate insolvency and reorganization. We must try, within as brief a space as possible, first to describe the procedure followed prior to the amendatory legislation beginning in 1933. Secondly, to summarize the changes brought about by the recent statutes, and finally, to evaluate the bondholder's position as it now appears. The latter will be especially difficult since the new laws have not yet had time to prove their merits or deficiencies in actual practice. The old pattern for corporate reorganization went usually as follows. Inability to pay interest or principal of indebtedness led to an application by the corporation itself for a receiver. It was customary to select a friendly court. The receiver was generally the company's president. The bondholders' interests were represented by protective committees ordinarily formed by the investment banking houses that had floated the issues. A reorganization plan was agreed upon by the committees and then approved by the court. The plan usually represented a compromise of the conflicting interests of the various ranks of security holders, under which, generally speaking, everyone retained some interest in the new company, and everyone made some sacrifice. In numerous cases, however, small and well-entrenched issues at the top were paid off or left undisturbed, and in hopeless situations, stock issues were sometimes completely wiped out. The actual mechanics of reorganization was through a foreclosure or bankruptcy sale. The properties were bought in behalf of the assenting security holders, and creditors who refused to participate received in cash their pro rata share, if any, of the sale price. This price was usually set so low that everyone was better off to join in the plan and take new securities rather than to stay out and take cash. Between 1933 and 1939, this procedure was completely transformed by a series of remedial laws, the most important of which was the Chandler Act. The defects for which a cure was desired were of two kinds. On the one hand, the necessity for paying non-assenting bondholders had developed into a dilemma, because unduly low upset or minimum foreclosure sale prices were being frowned on by the courts, whereas payment of a fair price involved often an insuperable problem of finding the cash. More serious was the fact that the whole mechanics of reorganization tended to keep complete dominance of the situation in the hands of the old controlling group, who may have been inefficient or even dishonest, and who certainly had special interests to serve. Beginning with the 1933 changes, a reorganization technique was set up under which a plan accepted by two-thirds of the creditors and a majority of the stockholders, if they had some equity, and approved by the court, was made binding on all the security holders. This has done away with the cumbersome and otherwise objectionable device of the foreclosure sale. As perfected by the Chandler Act and the Trust Indenture Act of 1939, the new procedure for other than railroad companies includes the following additional important points. 1. The company must be turned over to at least one disinterested trustee. This trustee must decide whether any claims should be asserted against the old management and also whether or not the business is worth continuing. 2. Actual responsibility for devising a reorganization plan devolves on three disinterested agencies. 1. The trustee, who must present the plan in the first instance. 2. The SEC, when the liabilities exceed $3 million, who may submit an advisory opinion thereon. 3. And the judge, who must officially approve it. Although the security holders and their protective committees may make suggestions, their acceptance is not asked for until the disinterested agencies have done their work. Furthermore, apparently wide powers are now given the court to force acceptance upon classes of holders who have failed to approve in the requisite percentage, but the exact extent of these powers is still uncertain. 3. The reorganization plan must meet a number of standards of fairness prescribed in the statute, including provisions relating to voting power, publication of reports, etc. The court must specifically approve the new management. 4. The activities of protective committees are subject to close scrutiny and supervision. Reorganization costs of all kinds, including compensation to all and sundry, must receive court sanction. 5. As distinct from reorganization procedure proper, the Trust Indenture Act prescribes a number of requirements for trustees acting under bond indentures. These are designed both to obviate certain conflicts in interest that have caused considerable complaint and also to ensure a more active attitude by the trustee in behalf of the bondholders. There is no doubt at all in our minds that in the typical case, the recent legislation will prove highly beneficial. It should eliminate a number of the abuses formerly attaching to receiverships and reorganizations. It should also speed up materially the readjustment process. This should be true especially after more definite standards of fairness in reorganization plans have come to be established, so that there will not be so much room as heretofore for protracted disputes between the different ranks of security holders. Alternative remedy suggested. Despite these undoubted reforms in reorganization technique, we shall be bold enough to venture the assertion that the ideal protective procedure for bondholders may often be found along other and simpler lines. In our opinion, given a sufficiently simple debt structure, the best remedy for all injury suffered by bondholders is the immediate vesting in them of voting control over the corporation. together with an adequate mechanism to assure the intelligent exercise of such control. In many cases, the creditors would then be able to marshal the company's resources and earnings for their own protection in such a way as to avoid recourse to expensive and protracted judicial proceedings. Our suggestion falls into two parts. First, voting control by bondholders would, by the terms of the indenture, constitute the sole immediate remedy for any event of default, including non-payment of interest or principal. During such control, unpaid interest or principal would be considered subject to a grace period. But the directors representing the bondholders should have the right to apply for trusteeship under the Chandler Act if they feel that comprehensive reorganization is preferable to an indefinite continuance of the moratorium plus control. Secondly, this voting control could best be implemented through the indenture trustee, a large and financially experienced institution which is competent to represent the bondholders generally and to recommend to them suitable candidates for the controlling directorships. Stockholders' interests should continue to be represented on the board by minority directors. What this arrangement would mean, in effect, is the turning of a fixed interest bond into an income bond during the period of bondholders' control, and the postponement of maturing debt until voluntary extension or refinancing becomes feasible, or else until liquidation or sale is found to be the desirable course. It should also be feasible to extend the basic technique and principle of voluntary recapitalization by statute, now applying only to the various stock issues, to include a bond issue as well, when the plan emanates from bondholders' representatives who have the alternative of keeping control and merely waiting. Obviously, however, control cannot well be vested in creditors when they belong to several classes with conflicting interests. In such cases, Chandler Act proceedings would seem necessary to cut the Gordian knot. But theoretically, at least, a voting control arrangement is possible with a simple senior and a simple junior lien. If default should occur only with respect to the junior lien, voting control would pass to that issue. If the senior lien is defaulted, it would take control as a single class. Although these suggestions may inspire doubt because of their novelty, it should be pointed out that the idea of voting by bondholders is both an old one and growing in vogue. Although in the past it was an exceptional arrangement, we now find that many reorganization plans providing for issuance of income bonds give voting powers to these securities, generally calling for control of the board of directors until all or most of the issue is retired, or if interest is not paid in full. Furthermore, many indentures covering fixed interest bonds now provide for a vote by bondholders on amendments to the indenture. It is also common for Canadian trust indentures to provide for meetings of bondholders in order to amend the terms of the indenture, including even the postponement or change of interest or principal payments. Such meetings may be called by the trustee, by a stated proportion of the bondholders, or in certain instances by the company itself. It may be objected that the suggested arrangement would really give a bondholder no better legal rights than a preferred stockholder, and would thus relegate him to the unsatisfactory position of having both a limited interest and an unenforceable claim. Our answer must be that, if the control device can be developed properly, it would provide an adequate remedy for both bondholders and preferred stockholders. In that case, the basic contractual advantage of bonds over preferred shares would vanish, except to the extent of the right of bonds to repayment at a fixed date. We repeat, in conclusion, the point made in our discussion of the theory of preferred stocks, that the contractual disadvantage of preferred shares is, at bottom, not so much a matter of inherent legal rights as it is of practical corporate procedure and of the investor's own shortcomings. Tendency of securities of insolvent companies to sell below their fair value. Some additional aspects of the corporate reorganization question deserve attention. The first relates to the market action of securities of insolvent companies. Receiverships in the past have been productive generally of a vast and pervasive uncertainty which threatens extinction to the stockholders but fails to promise anything specific to the bondholders. As a result, there has been a tendency for the securities of companies in receivership to sell below their fair value in the aggregate, and also a tendency for illogical relationships to be established between the price of a bond issue in default and the price of the junior stock issues. Examples. The Fisk Rubber Company case is an excellent example of the former point. The Studebaker Corporation situation in September 1933 illustrates the latter. These examples may be found in the accompanying PDF. The company's securities were selling together for less than 1/3 of the cash alone and for only 1/7 of the net current assets, allowing nothing for the fixed property. The company's debt, selling at 40 cents on the dollar, was entitled to prompt payment in full before the stockholder received anything. Nevertheless, the market placed a much larger value upon the stock issues than upon the prior debt. Voluntary readjustment plans. Realization of the manifest disadvantages of receivership has often led bondholders to accept suggestions emanating from the management for voluntary reduction of their contractual claims. Arrangements of this kind have varied from the old-fashioned type of composition, in which creditors extended or even curtailed their claims, while the stockholders retained their interest intact, to cases where the bondholders received a substantial part of the stock equity. Examples. At the end of 1931, Radio Keith Orpheum Corporation, needing funds to meet pressing obligations, found ordinary financing impossible. The stockholders ratified a plan under which, in effect, they surrendered 75% of their stock interest, which was given in turn as a bonus to those who supplied the $11,600,000 required by purchasing debenture notes. Continued large losses, however, forced the company into receivership a year later. In 1933, Fox Film Corporation effected a recapitalization of the same general type. The stockholders gave up over 80% of their holdings, and this stock was in turn exchanged for nearly all of approximately $40 million of 5-year notes and bank debt. The Kansas City Public Service Company readjustment plan, also consummated in 1933, was designed to meet the simpler problem of reducing interest charges during a supposedly temporary period of subnormal earnings. It provided that the coupon rate on the 6% first mortgage bonds should be reduced to 3% during the 4 years 1933 to 1936, restored to 6% for 1937 to 1938, and advanced to 7% for 1939 to 1951, thus making up the 12% foregone in the earlier years. A substantial sinking fund contingent upon earnings was set up to retire the issue gradually and to improve its market position. It was obvious that the Kansas City Public Service bondholders were better off to accept temporarily the 3% which could be paid rather than to insist on 6% which could not be paid and thereby precipitate a receivership. The previous receivership of the enterprise, terminated in 1926, had lasted 6 years. In this case, the stockholders were not required to give up any part of their junior interest to the bondholders in return for the concessions made. While theoretically some such sacrifice and transfer would be equitable, it was not of much practical importance here because any stock bonus given to the bondholders would have had a very slight market value. It should be recognized as a principle, however, that the waiving of any important right by the bondholders entitles them to some quid pro quo from the stockholders, in the form either of a contribution of cash to the enterprise or of a transfer of some part of their claim on future earnings to the bondholders. In 1939, additional legislation of a temporary nature was adopted, designed to facilitate so-called voluntary reorganizations of railroads by making them binding on all security holders. This statute was intended specifically to aid the Baltimore and Ohio and Lehigh Valley roads, which had previously proposed voluntary reorganization plans. These were designed to reduce fixed interest charges and to extend current and near maturities. The stockholders, in each case, were to retain their interests intact. As we have previously stated, it is our opinion that voluntary readjustment plans are desirable in themselves, but they should be proposed after voting control over the corporation has passed to the bondholders, and they are in a position to choose between alternative courses of action. Change in the status of bond trustees. Not the least important of the remedial legislation enacted since 1933 is the Trust Indenture Act of 1939. This undertakes to correct a number of inadequacies and abuses in the administration of their duties by bond trustees. The chief criticism of the behavior of indenture trustees in the past is that they did not act as trustees at all, but merely as agents of the bondholders. This meant that, as a general rule, they took no action on their own initiative, but only when directed to do so, and were fully indemnified by a certain percentage of the bondholders. Indentures have said practically nothing about the duties of a trustee, but a great deal about his immunities and indemnification. The 1939 statute aims directly at this unsatisfactory situation by including the following provision in Section 315. Duties of the trustee in case of default. C. The indenture to be qualified shall contain provisions requiring the indenture trustee to exercise, in case of default, as such term is defined in the indenture, such of the rights and powers vested in it by such indenture, and to use the same degree of care and skill in their exercise as a prudent man would exercise or use under the circumstances in the conduct of his own affairs. There are further provisions limiting the use of so-called exculpatory clauses, which in the past made it impossible to hold a trustee to account for anything except provable fraud or else negligence so gross as to be equivalent thereto. A further cause of complaint arose from the fact that the indenture trustee has frequently been a creditor of the obligor, for example, a trust company holding its promissory notes, or else has been controlled by the same interests. These situations have created conflicts of interest or an unwillingness to act impartially and vigorously, which have militated strongly against the bondholders. The Trust Indenture Act of 1939 contains stringent provisions designed to terminate these abuses. The problem of the Protective Committee. Reform in the status of indenture trustees may lead to a solution of the vexing problem of the Protective Committee. Since 1929, the general status of protective committees has become uncertain and most unsatisfactory. Formerly, it was taken for granted that the investment bankers who floated the issue would organize a protective committee in the event of default. But in recent years, there has been a growing tendency to question the propriety or desirability of such action. Bondholders may lack faith in the judgment of the issuing house, or they may question its ability to represent them impartially because of other interests in or connections with the enterprise, or they may even consider the underwriters as legally responsible for the losses incurred. The arguments in favor of competent representation by agencies other than the houses of issue are therefore quite convincing. The difficulty lies, however, in securing such competent representation. With the original issuing houses out of the picture, anybody can announce himself as chairman of a protective committee and invite deposits. The whole procedure has become unstandardized and open to serious abuses. Duplicate committees often appear. An undignified scramble for deposits takes place. Persons with undesirable reputations and motives can easily inject themselves into the situation. The new bankruptcy legislation of 1938 introduced some improvement into this situation by subjecting the activities and compensation of protective committees to court scrutiny. In the case of railroads, a committee cannot take part in a proceeding without prior permission from the ICC. Further legislation will probably be enacted regulating in more detail the formation as well as the subsequent conduct of protective committees. A recommended reform. The whole procedure might readily be clarified and standardized now that the trustee under the indenture is expected to assume the duty of actively protecting the bond issue. The large institutions which hold these positions have the facilities, the experience, and the standing required for the successful discharge of such a function. There seems no good reason, in the ordinary case, why the trustee should not itself organize the protective committee, with one of its executive officers as chairman, and with the other members selected from among the larger bondholders or their nominees. The possible conflict of interest between the trustee as representative of all the bondholders and the protective committee as representative of the depositing holders only will be found on analysis rarely to be of more than technical and minor consequence. Such a conflict, if it should arise, could be solved by submission of the question to the court. There is no difficulty about awarding sufficient compensation to the trustee and its counsel for their labors and accomplishment on behalf of the bondholders. This arrangement envisages effective cooperation between the trustee and a group of bondholders who, in the opinion of the trustee, are qualified to represent the issue as a whole. The best arrangement might be to establish this bondholders group at the time the issue is sold, that is, without waiting for an event of default to bring it into being, in order that there may be from the very start some responsible and interested agency to follow the affairs of the corporation from the bondholder's standpoint and to make objections, if need be, to policies which may appear to threaten the safety of the issue. Reasonable compensation for this service should be paid by the corporation. This would be equivalent in part to representation of the bondholders on the board of directors. If the time were to arrive when the group would have to act as a protective committee on behalf of the bondholders, their familiarity with the company's affairs should prove of advantage. Chapter 19. Protective Covenants Continued. Prohibition of prior liens. A brief discussion is desirable regarding certain protective provisions other than those dealing with the ordinary events of default. The matter of safeguarding conversion and other participating privileges against dilution will be covered in the chapters dealing with senior securities with speculative features. Dealing first with mortgage bonds, we find that indentures almost always prohibit the placing of any new prior lien on the property. Exceptions are sometimes made in the case of bonds issued under a reorganization plan when it is recognized that a prior mortgage may be necessary to permit raising new capital in the future. Example: in 1926, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad Company issued $107 million of Series A mortgage 5% bonds and, junior thereto, $185 million of convertible adjustment mortgage 5s in exchange for securities of the bankrupt Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway Company. The indentures permitted the later issuance of an indefinite amount of first and refunding mortgage bonds, which would rank ahead of the Series A mortgage 5s. Equal and rateable security clause. When a bond issue is unsecured, it is almost always provided that it will share equally in any mortgage lien later placed on the property. Example: the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad Company sold a number of debenture issues between 1897 and 1908. These bonds were originally unsecured, but the indentures provided that they should be equally secured with any mortgage subsequently placed upon the property. In 1920, a first and refunding mortgage was authorized by the stockholders. Consequently, the earlier issues have since been equally secured with bonds issued under the new mortgage. They still carry the title of debentures, but this is now a misnomer. There is, however, an issue of 4% debentures due in 1957, which did not carry this provision and hence are unsecured. In 1939, the unsecured debenture 4s, due 1957, sold at one-third the price of the secured debenture 4s due 1956, for example 5 versus 16. Purchase money mortgages. It is customary to permit without restriction the assumption of purchase money mortgages. These are liens attaching only to new property subsequently acquired, and their assumption is not regarded as affecting the position of the other bondholders. The latter supposition is not necessarily valid, of course, since it is possible thereby to increase the ratio of total debt of the enterprise to the total shareholders' equity in a manner which might jeopardize the position of the existing bondholders. Subordination of bond issues to bank debt in reorganization. In the case of bonds or notes issued under a reorganization plan, it is sometimes provided that their claim shall be junior to that of present or future bank loans. This is done to facilitate bank borrowings which otherwise could be affected only by the pledging of receivables or inventories as security. An example of this arrangement is afforded by Aeolian Company 5-year secured 6% notes due in 1937, which were issued under a capital readjustment plan in partial exchange for the guaranteed 7% preferred stock of the company. The notes were subordinated to $400,000 of bank loans which were later paid. Safeguards against creation of additional amounts of the same issue. Nearly all bonds or preferred issues enjoy adequate safeguards in respect to the creation of additional amounts of the issue. The customary provisions require a substantial margin of earnings above the requirements of the issue as thus enlarged. For example, additional New York Edison Company first lien and refunding mortgage bonds may not be issued, except for refunding purposes, unless consolidated net earnings for a recent 12-month period have been at least 1 3/4 times the annual interest charges on the aggregate bonded indebtedness of the company, including those to be issued. In the case of Wheeling Steel Corporation first mortgage bonds, the required ratio is 2 times. Provisions of this kind with reference to earnings coverage are practically non-existent in the railroad field, however. Railroad bonds of the blanket mortgage type more commonly restrict the issuance of additional bonds through a provision that the total funded indebtedness shall not exceed a certain ratio to the capital stock outstanding, and by a limitation upon the emission of new bonds to a certain percentage of the cost or fair value of newly acquired property. See, for example, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company refunding and general mortgage bonds, and the Northern Pacific Railway Company refunding and improvement bonds. In the older bond issues, it was customary to close the mortgage at a relatively small fixed amount, thus requiring that additional funds be raised by the sale of junior securities. This provision gave rise to the favorably situated underlying bonds to which reference was made in Chapter 6. In the typical case, additional issues of mortgage bonds may be made only against pledge of new property worth considerably more than the increase in debt. See, for examples, Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company First Mortgage, under which further bonds may be issued to finance 75% of the cost of additions or improvements to the mortgaged properties. The New York Edison Company, Inc. First Lien and Refunding Mortgage, under which bonds may be issued in further amounts to finance additions and betterments up to 75% of the actual and reasonable expenditure therefor. Père Marquette Railway Company First Mortgage Bonds, which may be issued up to 80% of the cost or fair value, whichever is the lower, of newly constructed or acquired property. These safeguards are logically conceived and almost always carefully observed. Their practical importance is less than might appear, however, because in the ordinary instance the showing stipulated would be needed anyway in order to attract buyers for the additional issue. Working capital requirements. The provisions for maintaining working capital at a certain percentage of bonded debt and for a certain ratio of current assets to current liabilities are by no means standardized. They appear only in industrial bond indentures. The required percentages vary and the penalties for non-observance vary also. In most cases, the result is merely the prohibition of dividends until the proper level or ratio of working capital is restored. In a few cases, the principal of the bond issue may be declared due. Examples: 1. Sole penalty prohibition of dividends. B.F. Goodrich first 4 1/4 due 1956 and Wilson and Company first 4s due 1955 require current assets to equal total indebtedness, that is, net quick assets to equal funded debt. In the case of West Virginia Pulp and Paper first 4 1/2s due 1952, subsidiary preferred stocks are included with funded debt. The provisions of Fairbanks, Morse, and Company Debenture 4s due 1956 require that current assets equal A. 110% of total liabilities and B. 200% of current liabilities. In the case of Wheeling Steel First 4 1/2s due 1966 and Republic Steel General 4 1/2s due 1956, current assets must equal 300% of current liabilities, and net current assets must equal 50% of the funded debt. 2. Failure to meet requirement is an event of default. Skelly Oil Debenture 4s due 1951 and serial notes due 1937 to 1941. Here, the company agrees to maintain current assets equal to at least 200% of current liabilities. In the case of Continental Steel 4 1/2s due 1946, the required ratio is 115%. Among former examples may be cited American Machine and Foundry 6s due 1939, which had a twofold provision. The first prohibiting dividends unless net current assets equal 150% of the outstanding bond issue, and the second requiring unconditionally that the net current assets be maintained at 100% of the face value of outstanding bonds. In the case of United States Radiator Corporation 5s due 1938, the company agreed at all times to maintain net working capital equal to 150% of the outstanding funded debt. It would appear to be sound theory to require regularly some protective provisions on the score of working capital in the case of industrial bonds. We have already suggested that an adequate ratio of net current assets to funded debt be considered as one of the specific criteria in the selection of industrial bonds. This criterion should ordinarily be set up in the indenture itself so that the bondholder will be entitled to the maintenance of a satisfactory ratio throughout the life of the issue and to an adequate remedy if the figure declines below the proper point. The prohibition of dividend payments under such conditions is sound and practicable, but the more stringent penalty, which terms a deficiency of working capital an event of default, is not likely to prove effective or beneficial to the bondholder. The objection that receivership harms rather than helps the creditors applies with particular force in this connection. Referring to the United States Radiator 5s mentioned above, we may point out that the balance sheet of January 31, 1933 showed a default in the 150% working capital requirement. The net current assets were $2,735,000, or only 109% of the $2,518,000 bond issue. Nevertheless, the trustee took no steps to declare the principal due, nor was it asked to do so by the required number of bondholders. In all probability, a receivership invoked for this reason would have been considered as highly injurious to the bondholder's interests. But this attitude would mean that the provision in question should never have been included in the indenture. Voting control as a remedy. We have previously advanced and discussed the suggestion that the bondholder's right to the appointment of trustees in the event of any default might well be replaced by a right to receive voting control over the enterprise. Whatever the reader's view as to the soundness of this suggestion as applied to default in payment of interest or principal, we imagine that he will agree with us that it has merit in the case of secondary defaults. For example, failure to maintain working capital as agreed, or to make sinking fund payments for the present alternatives, either to precipitate insolvency or to do nothing at all, are alike completely unsatisfactory. Protective provisions for investment trust issues. Investment trust bonds belong in a special category, we believe, because by their nature they lend themselves to the application of stringent remedial provisions. Such bonds are essentially similar to the collateral loans made by banks on marketable securities. As a protection for these bank loans, it is required that the market value of the collateral be maintained at a certain percentage in excess of the amount owed. In the same way, the lenders of money to an investment trust should be entitled to demand that the value of the portfolio continuously exceed the amount of the loans by an adequate percentage, for example, 25%. If the market value should decline below this figure, the investment trust should be required to take the same action as any other borrower against marketable securities. It should either put up more money, that is, raise more capital from the stockholders, or sell out securities and retire debt with the proceeds, in an amount sufficient to restore the proper margin. The disadvantages that inhere in bond investment generally justify the bond buyer in insisting upon every possible safeguard. In the case of investment trust bonds, a very effective measure of protection may be assured by means of the covenant to maintain the market value of the portfolio above the bonded debt. Hence, investors in investment trust issues should demand this type of protective provision and, what is equally important, they should require its strict enforcement. Although this stand will inflict hardship upon the stockholders when market prices fall, this is part of the original bargain, in which the stockholders agreed to take most of the risk in exchange for the surplus profits. A survey of bond indentures of investment trusts discloses a signal lack of uniformity in the matter of these protective provisions. Most of them do require a certain margin of asset value over debt as a condition to the sale of additional bonds. The required ratio of net assets to funded debt varies from 120%, for example, General American Investors, to 250%, for example, Niagara Shares Corporation. The more usual figures are 125 or 150%. A similar restriction is placed upon the payment of cash dividends. The ratio required for this purpose varies from 125%, for example, domestic and foreign investors, to 175%, which must be shown to permit cash dividends on Central States Electric Corporation common. The modal figure is probably 140 or 150%. But the majority of issues do not require at all times and unconditionally the maintenance of a minimum excess of asset value above bonded indebtedness. Examples of such a covenant may indeed be given. For example, General Public Service Corporation Convertible Debenture 5s due 1953. American European Securities Company Collateral 5s due 1958, and Affiliated Fund Inc. Secured Convertible Debenture 4.5s and 4s due 1949, all of which require maintenance of a 125% ratio of asset value at market to funded debt. In the case of affiliated fund, the remedy provided is the immediate sale by the trustee of pledged collateral and the retirement of bonds until the required ratio is restored. In the other cases, more elaborate machinery is invoked to declare the entire issue due and payable. We would suggest that provisions of this type, preferably those most simple of application, be a standard requirement for investment trust bond issues. Sinking funds. In its modern form, a sinking fund provides for the periodic retirement of a certain portion of a senior issue through payments made by the corporation. The sinking fund acquires the security by call, by means of sealed tenders, or by open market purchases made by the trustee or the corporation. In the latter case, the corporation turns in the bonds to the sinking fund in lieu of cash. The sinking fund usually operates once or twice a year, but provisions for quarterly and even monthly payments are by no means unusual. In the case of many bond issues, the bonds acquired by the sinking fund are not actually retired but are kept alive, that is, they draw interest, and these interest sums are also used for sinking fund purchases, thus increasing the latter at a compounded rate. Example: an important instance of this arrangement was supplied by the two issues of United States Steel Sinking Fund 5s, originally totaling $504 million. Bonds of the junior issue, listed on the New York Stock Exchange, were familiarly known in the bond market as steel sinkers. By adding the interest on bonds in the fund, the annual payments grew from $3,040,000 in 1902 to $11,616,000 in 1928. The following year, the entire outstanding amounts of these issues were retired or provided for. Benefits. The benefits of a sinking fund are of a twofold nature. The continuous reduction in the size of the issue makes for increasing safety and the easier repayment of the balance at maturity. Also important is the support given to the market for the issue through the repeated appearance of a substantial buying demand. Nearly all industrial bond issues have sinking funds. The public utility group shows about as many with as without. In the railroad list, sinking funds are exceptional. But in recent years, increasing emphasis has been laid upon the desirability of a sinking fund, and few long-term senior issues of any type are now offered without such a provision. Indispensable in some cases. Under some circumstances, a sinking fund is absolutely necessary for the protection of a bond. This is true in general when the chief backing of the issue consists of a wasting asset. Bonds on mining properties invariably have a sinking fund, usually of substantial proportions and based upon the tonnage mined. A sinking fund of smaller relative size is regularly provided for real estate mortgage bonds. In all these cases, the theory is that the annual depletion or depreciation allowances should be applied to the reduction of the funded debt. Examples. A special example of importance was the large Interborough Rapid Transit Company first and refunding 5% issue due 1966, which was secured mainly by a lease on properties that belonged to the City of New York. Obviously, it was essential to provide through a sinking fund for the retirement of the entire issue by the time the lease expired in 1967, since the corporation would then be deprived of most of its assets and earning power. Similarly, with tobacco products 6 1/2s due in 2022, which depended for their value entirely upon the annual payments of $2,500,000 made by American Tobacco Company under a lease expiring in 2022. The absence of a sinking fund under conditions of this kind invariably leads to trouble. Examples. Federal Mining and Smelting Company supplied the unusual spectacle of a mining enterprise with a large preferred stock issue, $12 million, and furthermore, the preferred stock had no sinking fund. Declaration of a $10 dividend on the common in 1926 led to court action to protect the preferred stock against the threatened breakdown of its position through depletion of the mines, coupled with the distribution of cash earnings to the junior shares. As a result of the litigation, the company refrained from further common dividends until 1937 and devoted its surplus profits to reducing the preferred issue, which was completely retired in 1939. Iron Steamboat Company General Mortgage 4s due 1932 had no sinking fund, although the boats on which they were a lien were obviously subject to a constant loss in value. These bonds to the amount of $500,000 were issued in 1902 and were a second lien on the entire property of the company, consisting mainly of 7 small steamboats operating between New York City and Coney Island, junior to $100,000 of first mortgage bonds. During the years 1909 to 1925 inclusive, the company paid dividends on the common stock aggregating in excess of $700,000, and by 1922 had retired all of the first mortgage bonds through the operation of the sinking fund for that issue. At this point, the 4s, due 1932, became a first lien upon the entire property. In 1932, when the company went into bankruptcy, the entire issue was still outstanding. The mortgaged property was sold at auction in February 1933 for $15,050, a figure resulting in payment of less than 1 cent on the dollar to the bondholders. An adequate sinking fund might have retired the entire issue out of the earnings which were distributed to the stockholders. When the enterprise may be regarded as permanent, the absence of a sinking fund does not necessarily condemn the issue. This is true not only of most high-grade railroad bonds and of many high-grade utility bonds, but also of most of the select group of old-line industrial preferred stocks that merit an investment rating. For example, National Biscuit Preferred, which has no sinking fund. From the broader standpoint, therefore, sinking funds may be characterized as invariably desirable and sometimes, but not always, indispensable. Serial maturities as an alternative. The general object sought by a sinking fund may be obtained by the use of serial maturities. The retirement of a portion of the issue each year by reason of maturity corresponds to the reduction by means of sinking fund purchases. Serial maturities are relatively infrequent, their chief objection resting probably in the numerous separate market quotations that they entail. In the equipment trust field, however, they are the general rule. This exception may be explained by the fact that insurance companies and other financial institutions are the chief buyers of equipment obligations, and for their special needs, the variety of maturity dates proves a convenience. Serial maturities are also frequently employed in state and municipal financing. Problems of enforcement. The enforcement of sinking fund provisions of a bond issue presents the same problem as in the case of covenants for the maintenance of working capital. Failure to make a sinking fund payment is regularly characterized in the indenture as an event of default, which will permit the trustee to declare the principal due and thus bring about receivership. The objections to this remedy are obvious, and we can recall no instance in which the omission of sinking fund payments unaccompanied by default of interest was actually followed by enforcement of the indenture provisions. When the company continues to pay interest but claims to be unable to meet the sinking fund, it is not unusual for the trustee and the bondholders to withhold action and merely to permit arrears to accumulate. More customary is the making of a formal request to the bondholders by the corporation for the postponement of the sinking fund payments. Such a request is almost invariably acceded to by the great majority of bondholders, since the alternative is always pictured as insolvency. This was true even in the case of interborough rapid transit 5s, for which, as we have pointed out, the sinking fund was an essential element of protection. The suggestion made in respect to the working capital covenants, viz., that voting control be transferred to the bondholders in the event of default, is equally applicable to the sinking fund provision. In our view, that would be distinctly preferable to the present arrangement under which the bondholder must either do nothing to protect himself or else take the drastic and calamitous step of compelling bankruptcy. The emphasis we have laid upon the proper kind of protective provisions for industrial bonds should not lead the reader to believe that the presence of such provisions carries an assurance of safety. This is far from the case. The success of a bond investment depends primarily upon the success of the enterprise, and only to a very secondary degree upon the terms of the indenture. Hence, the seeming paradox that the senior securities that have fared best in the Depression have, on the whole, quite unsatisfactory indenture or charter provisions. The explanation is that the best issues as a class have been the oldest issues, and these date from times when less attention was paid than now to protective covenants. In Appendix Note 34, we present two examples of the opposite kind. Willie's Overland Company First 6 1/2s due 1933, and Berkey and Gay Furniture Company First 6s due 1941, wherein a combination of a strong statistical showing with all the standard protective provisions failed to safeguard the holders against a huge subsequent loss. But while the protective covenants we have been discussing do not guarantee the safety of the issue, they nevertheless add to the safety and are therefore worth insisting upon. Chapter 20. Preferred Stock Protective Provisions. Maintenance of Junior Capital. Preferred stocks are almost always accorded certain safeguards against the placing of new issues ahead of them. The standard provision prohibits either a prior stock or a mortgage bond issue, except upon approval by vote of 2/3 or 3/4 of the preferred stock. The prohibition is not made absolute because conditions are always within contemplation under which the preferred stockholders may find it to their advantage to authorize the creation of a senior issue. This may be done because new financing through a bond issue is necessary to avoid receivership. An example is afforded by Eidingand Schild Company in 1932. According to the provisions of the 6.5% first preferred stock, the company could not create a mortgage, lien, or charge on any of its property except purchase money obligations, extensions of existing mortgages, and pledge of liquid assets to secure loans made in the ordinary course of business. Because of the precarious financial condition of the company in 1932, the preferred stockholders authorized certain financial rearrangements, including the creation of a $5,500,000 issue of 5% debentures containing certain provisions, the effect of which was to create a special charge against fixed properties. Protection against creation of unsecured debt desirable. It is a common practice to give preferred stockholders no control over the creation of unsecured debt. This point is exemplified by the American Metal Company, which in 1930 issued $20 million of debenture notes without vote of the preferred stockholders, but in 1933 was compelled to ask for their approval of the possible pledging of collateral to refund the notes at maturity. This distinction appears to us to be unsound, since unsecured debt is just as much a threat to a preferred stock as is a mortgage obligation. It does seem illogical to provide, as is usually done, that preferred stockholders may forbid the issuance of new preferred shares ranking ahead of or equivalent to theirs, and also of any secured indebtedness, but that they have nothing to say about the creation of a debenture bond issue, however large. Presumably, this exclusion arose from the desire to permit bank borrowing for ordinary business purposes, but this point may be taken care of by a specific stipulation to that effect, just as the standard provision now used permits the pledge of assets to secure loans made in the ordinary course of business without requiring preferred stockholders' consent. The preferred stockholders' vote is rather frequently availed of to permit the issuance of an equal ranking or even a prior security which is to be exchanged for the preferred stock itself under a recapitalization plan, the latter usually being designed to dispose of accumulated dividends. By giving the new issue equality with or priority over the old, stockholders who might otherwise be inclined to reject the composition are almost compelled to accept it. Examples. In 1930, Austin Nichols and Company had 7% preferred stock outstanding on which dividends of $21 per share had accumulated. The company offered to exchange each share for one share of $5 cumulative prior A stock plus 1.2 shares of common. By vote of the preferred stockholders accepting the plan, the new prior A stock was made senior to the old preferred. As a result, about 99% of the latter was turned in for exchange. International Paper and Fisk Rubber made similar adjustments of back dividends on the preferred in 1917 and 1925, respectively. In these cases, additional preferred stock was issued ranking equally with the old shares. Preferred stock sinking funds. Very few public utility or railroad preferred stock issues have a sinking fund provision, but in the case of industrial preferred stock offerings, sinking funds have become the general rule. The advantages that bonds derive from a sinking fund are equally applicable to preferred stocks. Furthermore, in view of the weak contractual position of preferred stocks, which we have frequently emphasized, there is the more reason for the buyer to insist on special protective arrangements of this kind. But although a sinking fund is thus a highly desirable feature of a preferred issue, its presence is no assurance, nor is its absence a negation of adequate safety. The list of 21 preferred stocks given in Chapter 14 that maintained an investment status throughout 1932 to 1933 contains only one issue with a sinking fund provision. As previously explained, this paradox is due to the fact that nearly all the strong industrial preferreds are old established issues, and the sinking fund is a relatively recent development. The amount of the sinking fund is usually fixed at a certain percentage of the maximum amount of preferred stock at any time outstanding, 3% being perhaps the most frequent figure. Less often, the amount is based on a percentage of profits. There are a number of variations and technicalities of a descriptive nature which we shall not detail. In most cases, the payment of the sinking fund is obligatory, provided 1. Preferred dividends have been paid in full or provided for, and 2. There remain surplus profits equal to the sinking fund requirement. A small number of preferred stocks are protected by an agreement to maintain net current assets, usually at 100% of the preferred issue or 100% of the preferred stock plus bond issues. In some cases, the penalty for non-observance is merely a prohibition of common dividends. For example, Sidney Blumenthal and Company, whereas in other cases, voting control passes to the preferred stock. For example, A.G. Spalding and Brothers, 7% first preferred, where working capital was required to equal 125% of the preferred issue. Voting power in the event of non-payment of dividends. The second general type of protective provision for preferred stocks relates to voting power accruing in the event of non-payment of dividends. As far as we know, these stipulations apply only to cumulative issues. The arrangement varies with respect to when the voting power becomes effective and to the degree of control bestowed. In a few cases, for example, Kaufman Department Stores 7% preferred and Royal Baking Powder Company 6% preferred, the voting right accrues after one dividend is omitted. At the other extreme, the right becomes effective only after 8 quarterly payments are in default. For example, Brunswick Balke Colander Company. The customary period allowed is 1 year. The right conferred upon the preferred stock may be 1. To vote exclusively for the directors. 2. To elect separately a majority of the board. 3. To elect separately a minority of the board. Or 4. To vote share for share with the common stock. Example of 1. McKesson and Robbins, Inc., preferred stock, received the sole right to elect the directors upon omission of the fourth quarterly dividend in December 1932. Example of 2. In 1933, Hahn Department Stores Preferred obtained the right to elect a majority of the board because of the omission of 4 quarterly dividends. Example of 3. Universal Pictures First Preferred has the right to elect 2 directors in the event of default of 6 quarterly dividends. Brooklyn and Queens Transit Corporation Preferred may elect 1/3 of the board if all arrears are not paid up within a year after any quarterly dividend is omitted. Example of 4. City Ice and Fuel Preferred votes share for share with the common in the event of non-payment of 4 quarterly dividends. The value of the last arrangement would seem to depend a good deal on whether the preferred stock is larger or smaller than the common issue. If larger, the share-for-share voting right could give the issue effective control, but in most cases the preferred issue is smaller, and hence this voting right is likely to prove ineffective. Composite rights. West Penn Power 4.5% preferred and Wisconsin Gas and Electric 4.25% preferred, both issued in 1939, have the following voting rights. 1. A vote share for share with the common unless 2. A year's dividend is in default, in which case the preferred stockholders have the right to elect 2 additional directors. 3. If 3 years' dividends are in default, they have the right to elect a majority of the board. North American Company's 6% preferred stock can always elect 1/4 of the board. If 3 years' dividends are in arrears, it can elect a majority of the directors. Non-cumulative issues need greater protection. The practices outlined above merit certain other criticisms of a more general nature. In the first place, although it is taken for granted that these special voting provisions should apply to cumulative preferred stocks only, the exclusion of non-cumulative issues seems to us to be most illogical. Their holders have certainly a greater reason to demand representation in the event of non-payment because they have no right to recover the lost dividends in the future. In our view, it should be established as a financial principle that any preferred stock that is not paying its full dividend currently should have some separate representation on the board of directors. On the other hand, we do not consider it proper to deprive the common stock of all representation when preferred dividends are unpaid. Complete domination of the board by the preferred stockholders may lead to some practices distinctly unfair to the common stock. For example, perpetuation of preferred stock control by unnecessarily refraining from paying up back dividends in full. An alert minority on the board of directors, even though powerless in the actual voting, may be able to accomplish a great deal in preventing unfair or unsound practices. A general canon regarding voting power. From the foregoing discussion, a general canon with respect to voting power may readily be formulated. The standard arrangement should give every preferred and every common issue the separate right to elect some directors under all circumstances. It would be logical for the common stock to elect the majority of the board as long as preferred dividends were regularly paid, and equally logical that whenever the full dividend was not paid on either a cumulative or non-cumulative preferred issue, the right to choose the majority of the board should pass to the preferred stockholders. Adequate protection for preferred issues should require that voting control pass to the holders in the event not only of default in dividends, but also of non-payment of the sinking fund or the failure to maintain working capital as stipulated. A few charters, for example those of Bayek Cigars and A.G. Spalding, afford this threefold remedial right to the preferred stockholders. In our view, this practice should be standard instead of exceptional. Value of voting control by preferred stock may be questioned. Viewing the matter realistically, it must be admitted that the vesting of voting control in holders of a preferred issue does not necessarily prove of benefit to them. In some cases, perhaps, no effective use can be made of this privilege. In other cases, the holders are too inert or too poorly advised to protect their interests even though they have power to do so. These practical limitations may be illustrated by a case in point, viz. The Maytag Company. In 1928, this enterprise, manufacturing washing machines, was recapitalized and issued the following securities: 100,000 shares of $6 cumulative first preferred, 320,000 shares of $3 cumulative preference second preferred, 1,600,000 shares of common. Approximately 80% of all these shares were received by the Maytag family. Through investment bankers, they sold to the public their holdings of first and second preferred. This netted them individually, that is, not the company, the sum of about $20 million. They retained control of the business through their ownership of common stock. The charter provided that neither preferred issue should have voting rights unless 4 quarterly dividends were defaulted on either. In that case, both issues, voting together as a single class, would have the right to elect a majority of the directors. In 1932, dividends were omitted on both classes of preferred. Voting control consequently passed to the holders of these issues early in 1933. Peculiarly enough, the only change made during the 1932 to 1933 period in the board of directors was the resignation of the single member who, as partner of one of the issuing houses, had presumably represented the preferred stockholders. All of the 5 directors remaining were operating officials and closely identified with the common stock ownership. In the meantime, the price of the 2 preferred issues declined to 15 and 3 1/8 respectively, as compared with the original offering prices of 101 and 50. Reviewing the situation, we see private owners of a business selling a preferred claim against its profits for a very large sum, which they retained individually. To protect the public's stake in the enterprise, the preferred issues were given voting control in the event of continued non-payment of dividends. This event occurred, and with it a catastrophic decline in the value of the shares. But the new voting control was not exercised, and the board of directors remained dominated, even more completely than before, by those owning the common stock. Wall Street's attitude toward this incident would be that, since the management of the company was honest and capable, a change in the directorate would be unnecessary and even unwise. In our opinion, this reasoning misses the basic point. No doubt, the operating management should remain unchanged, possibly, though by no means certainly, directors representing the preferred stock would follow the same financial policies in matters affecting the senior issues as would be followed by a board identified with the common stock. But the crux of the matter is that these decisions should actually be made by a board of directors of which the majority has been selected by the preferred stockholders in accordance with their rights. Regardless of whether or not a change in the board would result in any change in policy, the directors should be chosen as provided in the Articles of Incorporation. For otherwise, the voting provision is entirely meaningless. It becomes merely a phrase to persuade the preferred stock buyer into believing he has safeguards that are in fact non-existent. Recommended procedure in such cases. In the author's view, the proper procedure in cases such as the Maytag situation is perfectly clear. The preferred stockholders individually have no satisfactory means of going about the nomination and election of directors to represent them. This duty should devolve upon the issuing houses, and they should discharge it conscientiously. They should, 1. Obtain a list of the preferred stockholders of record, 2. Advise them of their new voting rights, and 3. Recommend to them a slate of directors and request their proxies to vote for these nominees. The directors suggested should, of course, be as well qualified as possible for their posts. They must be free from any large interest in or close affiliation with the common stock, and it would be desirable if they were themselves substantial owners of preferred shares. In the case of preferred stock issued pursuant to reorganization, there may be no issuing house to take the initiative, but this may be done by the same agencies formerly active in behalf of the security holders in the reorganization itself. It is quite possible, nonetheless, that the directors chosen by the preferred stockholders will be incompetent or, for other reasons, fail to represent their interests properly. But this is not a valid argument against the possession and the exercise of voting power by preferred stockholders. The same objection applies to voting rights of common stockholders and of citizens. The remedy is not disenfranchisement, but education. As we have previously pointed out, a combination of adequate voting control provisions for preferred shares with their prompt and effective use could largely overcome the disadvantages inherent in the absence of an unqualified legal right to receive dividends. But until both these conditions are fulfilled, we must continue to stress the practical superiority for investors of the bond form over the preferred stock form. Maintenance of adequate junior capital. We wish to call attention finally to a protective requirement for both bondholders and preferred stockholders, which is technically of great importance, but which frequently is not taken care of in indentures or charter provisions. The point referred to is the maintenance of an adequate amount of junior capital. We have previously emphasized the principle that such junior capital is an indispensable condition for any sound fixed value investment. No loan could prudently be made to a business at 3 or 4% interest unless the business were worth a considerable amount over and above the amount borrowed. This is elementary and well understood, but it is not generally realized that the corporation laws permit the withdrawal of substantially all the capital and surplus after the loan has been made. This can be done by the legal process of reducing the capital to a nominal sum and distributing the amount of the reduction to the stockholders. Such a maneuver the creditors are powerless to prevent unless they have specifically guarded against it in their loan contract. Danger in the right to reduce stated capital. Let us attempt to bring this point home by a hypothetical example. A company is engaged in the business of lending money on installment accounts. It has $2,100,000 of capital and surplus. Ostensibly for the purpose of expanding its operations, it borrows $2 million by sale of a 20-year 5% debenture bond issue. the earnings and stock equity appear to provide sufficient protection for the bonds. Business subsequently falls off, and the company has a substantial amount of unused cash. The stockholders vote to reduce the capital to $100,000. In theory, it might be reduced to $1, and they receive back $2 million in cash as a return of capital. In effect, the stockholders have recovered their capital with the cash supplied by the bondholders, but they retain ownership and control of the business together with the right to receive all profits above 5%. The bondholders find themselves in the absurd position of having provided all the capital and having thereby assumed all of the risk of loss without any share in the profits above ordinary interest. Such a development would be most unfair, but apparently it can be carried out legally unless the indenture of the bond issue specifically prevented it by stipulating that no distributions could be made to the stockholders that would reduce the capital and surplus below a certain figure. The removal of the bondholders' cushion by its direct withdrawal in cash, as in our hypothetical example, is a rare, perhaps unexampled occurrence. But a corresponding situation does actually arise in practice through a combination of large operating losses followed by a reduction in capital to wipe out the consequent balance sheet deficit. Examples. In Chapter 38, we refer to an extraordinary example of this kind, viz., the Interborough Metropolitan case. Here, the stated capital was reduced by stockholders' action to eliminate a huge profit and loss deficit. Following this action, earnings of a distinctly temporary character were dispersed in dividends instead of being conserved for the benefit of the bondholders, who later suffered a tremendous loss. To effect the capital reduction under the laws then existing, a merger with a dummy corporation was resorted to. The same artifice has been used several times since in connection with recapitalization schemes. For example, Central Leather Company in 1926 and Kelly Springfield Tire Company in 1932. As a result of losses sustained during the Depression of the 1930s, numerous reductions of capitalization have been voted by the stockholders. These actions have been taken without consulting the bondholders. Most of such reductions have been effected by changes from no-par shares to shares of a low-par value. Frequently, this has been accompanied by write-offs of intangible assets or markdowns of fixed assets. Such write-downs of asset values on one side of the balance sheet and capital on the other are of no special significance from the bondholder's standpoint, except possibly in the fact that they may permit unduly low depreciation charges and therefore unduly liberal dividend payments. But in most of these cases, a substantial sum also has effectively been transferred from capital to surplus and thus made available to absorb future operating losses and to facilitate the resumption of dividends before past losses have been made up. For example, Remington Rand, Inc. changed its common stock from no par to $1 par, and thereby, together with cancellation of shares held by the company itself, reduced the stated value of the common from $17,133,000 to $1,291,000. It applied $7,800,000 of this reduction to write down its intangible assets, $2,300,000 additional to mark down its plant account, and $400,000 for miscellaneous write-downs and reserves. This left about $5,350,000 actually transferred from capital to surplus. In the same manner, the par value of Lexington Utilities $6 preferred stock was reduced in 1935 from $100 to $25 per share, with no change in dividend or other significant rights, and for the sole purpose of eliminating a capital deficit and permitting the resumption of preferred dividends. This action destroyed about 3/4 of the margin above funded debt which bondholders were formerly entitled to have maintained before dividends could be paid. In subsequent years, large sums were dispersed in preferred dividends that otherwise would have been held or invested to make good the bondholders' cushion. Similar reductions were made by New York Shipbuilding Corporation, Serval, Inc., Warner Brothers Pictures, Inc., H.F. Wilcox Oil and Gas Company, Thermoid Company. National Acme Company reduced the par value of its capital stock twice, from $50 to $10 in 1924 and from $10 to $1 in 1933. The result was a telescoping of its stated capital from $25 million into $500,000. In the case of Capital Administration Company, not only was the stated value of the common stock reduced, but the $3 cumulative preferred stock was also given a fictitiously low par value of $10. Some issues protected against this danger. Fortunately for the bondholders in some of these cases, the indentures contain provisions prohibiting dividends or other distributions to the stockholders unless there is an adequate margin of resources above the indebtedness. In the case of Remington Rand debenture 5 1/2, a threefold protection was supplied by the terms of the trust indenture, viz. 1. Cash dividends may be paid only out of earned surplus. 2. Cash dividends may be paid only if net tangible assets after deducting the dividend in question shall equal at least 175% of the funded debt. 3. No stock may be retired in excess of $3,500,000 except out of additional paid-in capital or earned surplus. The last provision is directed against the reduction of junior capital by buying in preferred or common stock. It would be more satisfactory if it prohibited the acquisition rather than the retirement of the company's own stock. Protective provisions of these various kinds appear in many, but by no means all indentures. They are absent, for example, in the case of Lexington Utilities, New York Shipbuilding, and Servell Bonds, to name three of the companies that reduced their stated capital by stockholders' vote. From the foregoing discussion, it should be clear that these covenants are essential to the proper safeguarding of a bond issue. Conscientious issuing houses and intelligent investors should insist on their inclusion in all indentures. Anomalous position of preferred stocks in this connection. The position of preferred stocks in this matter is a somewhat peculiar one. Their holders have the same interest as has bondholders in the maintenance of an adequate amount of junior capital, but losses that result in a balance sheet deficit will legally prevent the payment not only of common dividends but of preferred dividends as well. Hence, the preferred stockholders are likely to be very anxious for a reduction in the stated value of the common stock, which will eliminate the profit and loss deficit and permit the resumption of dividends on their own shares. In such cases, their interest in maintaining an adequate amount of junior capital is offset by their greater desire to make dividends possible. At the close of 1921, for example, losses taken by Montgomery Ward had created a profit and loss deficit of $7,700,000, which had compelled suspension of the preferred dividend. Accordingly, holders of this issue welcomed a reduction in the stated value of the common stock from $28,300,000 to $11,400,000, which eliminated the balance sheet deficit and thus permitted the resumption of the preferred dividends and discharge of the accumulations. This situation has even been exploited by the common stockholders to compel large concessions from the preferred holders in connection with a profit and loss deficit. A notorious example is the Central Leather Reorganization Plan, resulting in the formation of a successor company, United States Leather. As the price of their vote in favor of reducing the stated capital, the common stockholders forced the preferred holders to waive their back dividends and to reduce their cumulative right to future dividends. Preferred stocks need both specific protective provisions and voting power for their protection. These considerations confirm our previously expressed criticisms of the preferred stock form as an investment medium. It is not particularly difficult to safeguard these issues against the withdrawal of junior capital. This is frequently done and should always be done. But to deal satisfactorily from the preferred stockholder's standpoint with conditions resulting in a profit and loss deficit is a difficult matter. It requires, above all, complete control of the corporation's policies by directors representing the preferred issue. This serves to emphasize the importance of adequate voting power for preferred stockholders in the event of non-payment of dividends. Chapter 21. Supervision of Investment Holdings. Traditional concept of permanent investment. A generation ago, permanent investment was one of the stock phrases of finance. It was applied to the typical purchase by a conservative investor and may be said to have embraced three constituent ideas. 1. Intention to hold for an indefinite period. 2. Interest solely in annual income without reference to fluctuations in the value of principal. And 3. Freedom from concern over future developments affecting the company. A sound investment was by definition one that could be bought, put away, and forgotten except on coupon or dividend dates. This traditional view of high-grade investments was first seriously called into question by the unsatisfactory experiences of the 1920 to 1922 Depression. Large losses were taken on securities that their owners had considered safe beyond the need of examination. The ensuing 7 years, although generally prosperous, affected different groups of investment issues in such divergent ways that the old sense of complete security, with which the term gilt-edged securities was identified, suffered an ever-increasing impairment. Hence, even before the market collapse of 1929, the danger ensuing from neglect of investments previously made and the need for periodic scrutiny or supervision of all holdings had been recognized as a new canon in Wall Street. This principle, directly opposed to the former practice, is frequently summed up in the dictum, "There are no permanent investments." Periodic inspection of holdings necessary but troublesome. That the newer view is justified by the realities of fixed value investment can scarcely be questioned. But it must be frankly recognized also that this same necessity for supervision of all security holdings implies a rather serious indictment of the whole concept of fixed value investment. If risk of loss can be minimized only by the exercise of constant supervisory care, in addition to the painstaking process of initial choice, has not such investment become more trouble than it is worth? Let it be assumed that the typical investor, following the conservative standards of selection herein recommended, will average a yield of 3.5% on a diversified list of corporate securities. This 3.5% return appears substantially higher than the 2.5% obtainable from long-term United States government bonds, and also more attractive than the 2 or 2.5% offered by savings banks. Nevertheless, if we take into account not only the effort required to make a proper selection, but also the greater efforts entailed by the subsequent repeated checkups, and if we then add thereto the still inescapable risk of depreciation or definite loss, it must be confessed that a rather plausible argument can be constructed against the advisability of fixed value investments in general. The old idea of permanent, trouble-free holdings was grounded on the not illogical feeling that if a limited return investment could not be regarded as trouble-free, it was not worth making at all. Superiority of United States savings bonds. Objectively considered, investment experience of the last decade undoubtedly points away from the fixed value security field and into the direction of 1. United States government bonds or savings bank deposits, or 2. Admittedly speculative operations with endeavors to reduce risk and increase profits by means of skillful effort, or 3. A search for the exceptional combination of safety of principal with a chance for substantial profit. For all people of moderate means, United States savings bonds undoubtedly offer the most suitable medium for fixed value investment. In fact, we are inclined to state categorically that, on the basis of 1940 interest yields, their superiority to other issues makes them the only sensible purchase of this type. The reason is, of course, that it is not possible to obtain a significantly higher return on investment issues, save for a few obscure exceptions, without injecting an element of principal risk which makes the commitment unsound. In addition, the holder's redemption right before maturity is a very valuable feature of the bonds. If only small investors as a class would resolutely reject the various types of savings plans with their multifarious titles now being offered to them with an ostensible sure income return of 4 to 6%, and thankfully take advantage of the 2.90% available on United States savings bonds, we are convinced that they would save in the aggregate an enormous amount of money, trouble, and heartbreak. But even if the ordinary investment problems of most investors could be thus simply disposed of, many investors would remain who must consider other types of fixed value investment. These include 1. Institutional investors of all kinds, for example, savings and commercial banks, insurance companies, educational and philanthropic agencies. 2. Other large investors, for example, corporations and wealthy individuals. 3. Those with moderate income derived wholly from investments, since the maximum annual return ultimately obtainable from United States savings bonds is limited to $2,500 per annum. It is true also that many smaller investors will, for one reason or another, prefer to place part of their funds in other types of fixed value investment. The second alternative, viz., to speculate instead of investing, is entirely too dangerous for the typical person who is building up his capital out of savings or business profits. The disadvantages of ignorance, of human greed, of mob psychology, of trading costs, of weighting of the dice by insiders and manipulators will, in the aggregate, far overbalance the purely theoretical superiority of speculation in that it offers profit possibilities in return for the assumption of risk. We have, it is true, repeatedly argued against the acceptance of an admitted risk to principal without the presence of a compensating chance for profit. In so doing, however, we have not advocated speculation in place of investment, but only intelligent speculation in preference to obviously unsound and ill-advised forms of investment. We are convinced that the public generally will derive far better results from fixed value investments if selected with exceeding care than from speculative operations, even though these may be aided by considerable education in financial matters. It may well be that the results of investment will prove disappointing, but if so, the results of speculation would have been disastrous. The third alternative, to look for investment merit combined with an opportunity for profit, presents, we believe, a suitable field for the talents of the securities analyst. But it is a dangerous objective to hold before the untrained investor. He can readily be persuaded that safety exists where there is only promise, or, conversely, that an attractive statistical showing is alone sufficient to warrant purchase. Having thus considered the three alternative policies open to those with capital funds, we see that fixed value investment in the traditional field of high-grade bonds and preferred stocks remains a necessary and desirable activity for many individuals and corporate bodies. It is quite clear also that periodic re-examination of investment holdings is necessary to reduce the risk of loss. What principles and practical methods can be followed in such supervision? Principles and problems of systematic supervision, switching. It is generally understood that the investor should examine his holdings at intervals to see whether or not all of them may still be regarded as entirely safe, and that if the soundness of any issue has become questionable, he should exchange it for a better one. In making such a switch, the investor must be prepared to accept a moderate loss on the holding he sells out, which loss he must charge against his aggregate investment income. In the early years of systematic investment supervision, this policy worked out extremely well. Seasoned securities of the high-grade type tended to cling rather tenaciously to their established price levels and frequently failed to reflect a progressive deterioration of their intrinsic position until some time after this impairment was discoverable by analysis. It was possible, therefore, for the alert investor to sell out such holdings to some heedless and unsuspecting victim who was attracted by the reputation of the issue and the slight discount at which it was obtainable in comparison with other issues of its class. The impersonal character of the securities market relieves this procedure of any ethical stigma, and it is considered merely as establishing a proper premium for shrewdness and a deserved penalty for lack of care. Increased sensitivity of security prices. In more recent years, however, investment issues have lost what may have been called their price inertia, and their quotations have come to reflect promptly any materially adverse development. This fact creates a serious difficulty in the way of effective switching to maintain investment quality. By the time that any real impairment of security is manifest, the issue may have fallen in price not only to a speculative level, but to a level even lower than the decline in earnings would seem to justify. One reason for this excessive price decline is that an unfavorable apparent trend has come to influence prices even more severely than the absolute earnings figures. The owner's natural reluctance to accept a large loss is reinforced by the reasonable belief that he would be selling the issue at an unduly low price, and he is likely to find himself compelled almost unavoidably to assume a speculative position with respect to that security. Exceptional margins of safety as insurance against doubt. The only effective means of meeting this difficulty lies in following counsels of perfection in making the original investment. The degree of safety enjoyed by the issue, as shown by quantitative measures, must be so far in excess of the minimum standards that a large shrinkage can be suffered before its position need be called into question. Such a policy should reduce to a very small figure the proportion of holdings about which the investor will subsequently find himself in doubt. It would also permit him to make his exchanges when the showing of the issue is still comparatively strong and while, therefore, there is a better chance that the market price will have been maintained. Example and conclusion. As a concrete example, let us assume that the investor buys an issue such as the Liggett and Myers Tobacco Company debenture 5s due 1951, which earned their interest an average of nearly 20 times in 1934 to 1938, as compared with the minimum requirement of 3 times. If a decline in profits should reduce the coverage to 4 times, he might prefer to switch into some other issue, if one can be found, that is earning its interest 8 to 10 times. On these assumptions, he would have a fair chance of obtaining a full price for the Liggett and Myers issue, since it would still be making an impressive exhibit. But if the influence of the downward trend of earnings has depressed the quotation to a large discount, then he could decide to retain the issue rather than accept an appreciable loss. In so doing, he would have the great advantage of being able to feel that the safety of investment was still not in any real danger. Such a policy of demanding very high safety margins would obviously prove especially beneficial if a period of acute depression and market unsettlement should supervene. It is not practicable, however, to recommend this as a standard practice for all investors because the supply of such strongly buttressed issues is too limited, and because, further, it is contrary to human nature for investors to take extreme precautions against future collapse when current conditions make for optimism. Policy in depression. Assuming that the investor has exercised merely reasonable caution in the choice of his fixed value holdings, how will he fare and what policy should he follow in a period of depression? If the depression is a moderate one, his investments should be only mildly affected market-wise and still less in their intrinsic position. If conditions should approximate those of 1930 to 1933, he could not hope to escape a severe shrinkage in the quotations and considerable uneasiness over the safety of his holdings. But any reasoned policy of fixed value investment requires the assumption that disturbances of the 1930 to 1933 amplitude are non-recurring in their nature and need not be specifically guarded against in the future. If the 1921 to 1922 and the 1937 to 1938 experiences are accepted instead as typical of the recurrent severe depression, a carefully selected investment list should give a reasonably good account of itself in such a period. The investor should not be stampeded into selling out holdings with a strong past record because of a current decline in earnings. He is likely, however, to pay more attention than usual to the question of improving the quality of his securities, and in many cases it should be possible to gain some benefits through carefully considered switches. The experiences of the 1937 to 1938 recession offer strong corroboration of the foregoing analysis. Practically all senior securities that would have met our stringent requirements at the end of 1936 came through the ensuing setback without serious damage market-wise. But bonds that have sold at high levels despite an inadequate overall earnings coverage, particularly a large number of railroad issues, suffered an enormous shrinkage in value. Sources of investment advice and supervision. Supervision of securities involves the question of who should do it as well as how to do it. Investors have the choice of various agencies for this purpose, of which the more important are the following. 1. The investor himself. 2. His commercial bank. 3. An investment banking or underwriting house. 4. A New York Stock Exchange firm. 5. The advisory department of a large trust company. 6. Independent investment counsel or supervisory service. The last two agencies charge fees for their service, whereas the three preceding supply advice and information gratis. Advice from commercial bankers. The investor should not be his own sole consultant unless he has training and experience sufficient to qualify him to advise others professionally. In most cases, he should at least supplement his own judgment by conference with others. The practice of consulting one's bank about investments is widespread, and it is undeniably of great benefit, especially to the smaller investor. If followed consistently, it would afford almost complete protection against the hypnotic wiles of the high-pressure stock salesman and his worthless blue-sky flotations. It is doubtful, however, if the commercial banker is the most suitable advisor to an investor of means. Although his judgment is usually sound, his knowledge of securities is likely to be somewhat superficial, and he cannot be expected to spare the time necessary for a thoroughgoing analysis of his client's holdings and problems. Advice from investment banking houses. There are objections of another kind to the advisory service of an investment banking house. An institution with securities of its own to sell cannot be looked to for entirely impartial guidance. However ethical its aims may be, the compelling force of self-interest is bound to affect its judgment. This is particularly true when the advice is supplied by a bond salesman whose livelihood depends upon persuading his customers to buy the securities that his firm has on its shelves. It is true that the reputable underwriting houses consider themselves as bound in some degree by a fiduciary responsibility toward their clients. The endeavor to give them sound advice and to sell them suitable securities arises not only from the dictates of good business practice, but more compellingly from the obligations of a professional code of ethics. Nevertheless, the sale of securities is not a profession but a business, and is necessarily carried on as such. Although in the typical transaction it is to the advantage of the seller to give the buyer full value and satisfaction, conditions may arise in which their interests are in serious conflict. Hence, it is impracticable and, in a sense, unfair to require investment banking houses to act as impartial advisors to buyers of securities, and, broadly speaking, it is unwise for the investor to rely primarily upon the advice of sellers of securities. Advice from New York Stock Exchange firms. The investment departments of the large stock exchange firms present a somewhat different picture. Although they also have a pecuniary interest in the transactions of their customers, their advice is much more likely to be painstaking and thoroughly impartial. Stock exchange houses do not ordinarily own securities for sale. Although at times they participate in selling operations which carry larger allowances than the ordinary market commission, their interest in pushing such individual issues is less vital than that of the underwriting houses who actually own them. At bottom, the investment business or bond department of stock exchange firms is perhaps more important to them as a badge of respectability than for the profits it yields. A tax made upon them as agencies of speculation may be answered in part by pointing to the necessary services that they render to conservative investors. Consequently, the investor who consults a large stock exchange firm regarding a small bond purchase is likely to receive time and attention out of all proportion to the commission involved. Admittedly, this practice is found profitable in the end as a cold business proposition because a certain proportion of the bond customers later develop into active stock traders. In behalf of the stock exchange houses, it should be said that they make no effort to persuade their bond clients to speculate in stocks, but the atmosphere of a brokerage office is perhaps not without its seductive influence. Advice from investment counsel. Although the idea of giving investment advice on a fee basis is not a new one, it has only recently developed into an important financial activity. The work is now being done by special departments of large trust companies, by a division of the statistical services, and by private firms designating themselves as investment counsel or investment consultants. The advantage of such agencies is that they can be entirely impartial, having no interest in the sale of any securities or in any commission on their clients' transactions. The chief disadvantage is the cost of the service, which averages about 0.5% per annum on the principal involved. As applied strictly to investment funds, this charge would amount to about 1/7 or 1/8 of the annual income, which must be considered substantial. In order to make their fees appear less burdensome, some of the private investment consultants endeavor to forecast the general course of the bond market and to advise their clients as to when to buy or sell. It is doubtful if trading in bonds to catch the market swings can be carried on successfully by the investor. If the course of the bond market can be predicted, it should be possible to predict that of the stock market as well, and there would be undoubted technical advantages in trading in stocks rather than in bonds. We are skeptical of the ability of any paid agency to provide reliable forecasts of the market action of either bonds or stocks. Furthermore, we are convinced that any combined effort to advise upon the choice of individual high-grade investments and upon the course of bond prices is fundamentally illogical and confusing. Much as the investor would like to be able to buy at just the right time and to sell out when prices are about to fall, experience shows that he is not likely to be brilliantly successful in such efforts, and that by injecting the trading element into his investment operations, he will disrupt the income return on his capital and inevitably shift his interest into speculative directions. It is not clear as yet whether or not advice on a fee basis will work out satisfactorily in the field of standard high-grade investments because of their relatively small income return. In the purely speculative field, the objection to paying for advice is that if the advisor knew whereof he spoke, he would not need to bother with the consultant's duties. It may be that the profession of advisor on securities will find its most practicable field in the intermediate region, where the advisor will deal with problems arising from depreciated investments, and where he will propose advantageous exchanges and recommend bargain issues selling considerably below their intrinsic value. Part 3. Senior Securities with Speculative Features. Introduction to Part 3. Investing in Distressed Credit by Dominique Miel. There is a certain gravity to Graham and Dodd. The book in your hands feels heavy and substantial. The spine is extra wide. There's a sense of the establishment in the author's names, sounding like something straight out of a Great Gatsby guest list. Their vocabulary tickles with evocative flourishes. Call me dull, but I never thought anything in my job could easily prove a costly snare to the unwary. You flinch at the allegory of Mr. Market created by Benjamin Graham because it is too apt a description of the people in the industry. This, according to the Wall Street Journal, is the urtext of modern value investing. Yes, I too had to look up this word. Thus, it would not be entirely illogical for Generation Z to conclude that the best use of security analysis is to prop up their laptop for a Zoom call. And you would be correct in assessing that this remarkable book, among many benefits, will put the camera exactly at your eye level, which is undeniably the most attractive video angle. Having propelled the founding fathers of value investing into acute 21st century relevance, let me set the record straight on Benjamin Graham, for there is more to him than meets the eye. First, Graham was born Grossbaum, a poor Jewish immigrant whose family name was changed to assimilate into American society and avoid anti-Semitism. Second, he was apparently fond of the axiom that he wished every day to do something foolish, something creative, and something generous. I suspect we would attract a different crowd to asset management with that subtitle on the cover. Indeed, it is an endearing and relatable motto, well suited to some spectacularly successful investors. I am looking at you, Warren Buffett, zipping around on the back of a golf cart at 91 years old, having pledged 99% of your fortune and still leading one of the most valuable companies on earth. Not to mention Seth Klarman, the Oracle of Boston, who incidentally invited me to write this introduction, thereby checking off generous and foolish in a single stroke. Last, Graham could quote Kierkegaard. Note to my fellow hedge fund managers, this is not the name of an artisanal beer. Here is the first lesson from Graham and Dodd. Don't rely on appearances, don't trust first impressions, don't jump to conclusions. But I digress. Imagine my reaction when asked to write an introduction to the investing in the distressed credit section of security analysis. I don't belong, I thought, and not in the least because I'm French, female, and funny. Consider the intellectual context. Two clans have battled to gain control of the investing theory landscape over the last 80-odd years. The Graham and Dodd gang, defenders of the value investing credo, who call New York's Columbia Business School their turf, posit that financial instruments, stocks in particular, have an intrinsic value that is separate and different from their trading value. Investing consists of buying stocks where the latter is below the former by a considerable margin of safety, that is, undervalued stocks, and cashing in when inevitably, albeit not necessarily swiftly, their trading value approaches intrinsic value. Their rivals, the modern portfolio clan from the mean streets of Chicago, led by Markowitz and Sharp, start with the efficient market theory that every stock price reflects all available information. There is no other value than the trading value. In other words, the intrinsic value is the trading value. Investing is therefore not about selecting undervalued stocks. It's about building a portfolio of securities that optimize expected return for a given level of risk. While the Chicago school equates volatility with risk, value investors tend to view volatility as a source of opportunity. I know what you are thinking. How did Steven Spielberg miss this perfect reboot for his West Side Story movie? Dancing fund managers in Patagonia vests and singing Nobel Prize winners in corduroy pants, duking it out over the shape of the efficient frontier. I was raised on the wrong side of the rumble for this book. Not only did I not go to Columbia Business School, I attended Stanford, where I was taught by Bill Sharp himself. As I started writing this essay, a recollection of his first lecture resurfaced. I hadn't given it a thought in 25 years. Professor Sharp considered the probability of two students in class sharing the same day and month for their birthday. Contrary to everyone's instinct, we calculated a non-trivial percentage, and not two, but three of us qualified. He proceeded to tell us that these odds are roughly the same as an investor beating the market 15 years in a row. For any one investor, those odds are infinitesimally low, but given the vast number of investors, it is reasonably likely that someone will do it. That turned out to be the case for Bill Miller, portfolio manager at Legg Mason, a staunch proponent and practitioner of value investing. According to Professor Sharp, Miller's streak of outperformance was not a validation of the value investing method. He was simply a dot on a normal distribution curve of outcomes. Somebody had to be. In my naivete, I registered the fact as a tidbit of statistics. Not so. Bill Sharp was proselytizing, and his class, Portfolio Management, had an indelible effect on my thinking. The idea of a true value has always struck me as nebulous at best and mystical at worst. Graham and Dodd themselves appeared conflicted on the matter, explaining that intrinsic value is that value which is justified by the facts, for example, the assets, earnings, dividends, and definite prospects, as distinct, let us say, from market quotations established by market manipulation or distorted by psychological excesses. But they also warned that it must always be remembered that the truth that the analyst uncovers is, first of all, not the whole truth, and secondly, not the immutable truth. Elsewhere, they admit that intrinsic value is an elusive concept, but can be approximated, just like it is quite possible to decide by inspection that a woman is old enough to vote without knowing her age, or that a man is heavier than he should be without knowing his weight. I don't know about you, but I've had a tough time estimating women's ages since my Beverly Hills orthodontist diversified into Botox, and I most definitely wouldn't pass judgment on a man's weight, at least not to his face. I believe deeply that security analysis cannot presume to lay down general rules as to the proper value of any given common stock. Practically speaking, there is no such thing. My former employer, where I invested for 20 years as a portfolio manager, was a multi-asset class manager, a value-oriented and event-driven hedge fund. However, of all the partners' portfolios, mine was consistently the lightest in public equities, rarely having any exposure at all. Plainly, I am not a stock picker. Blame it on my upbringing. If you described me as a bond girl, I bet no one would bat an eye. My supreme luck, however, was to discover that in a corner of the corporate bond market, distressed investing lay the extraordinary opportunity to fuse both schools of thought to form a glorious menage a trois, building a career along the way. Stressed and distressed investing entails buying the bonds or the loans of a company under severe operational or financial duress, either within bankruptcy or on the verge of filing for it. A bond has a contractual value, even a distressed bond selling at a deep discount to par. Thus, I could do away with the nebulous concept of a true value. I knew what I would recover if the value of the assets or business covered the face value of my claims. Second, the efficient market hypothesis starts with the important assumption of perfect liquidity, meaning that there are always willing buyers and sellers. While liquidity is, if not perfect, excellent for large capitalization stocks, distressed assets are liquid as quicksand and forced sellers abound. This means that I could ignore the debilitating notion that securities are perfectly priced. The distressed investor is left with the challenge of evaluating what payment is available and how to get it. In that respect, Graham and Dodd are the messiahs of distressed investing, their method highly relevant and oftentimes prescient, their book a terrific recipe for long-term investment success. The first commandment of the distressed investor is to focus on the downside. That is my read of Graham and Dodd's margin of safety concept, not the distance to the promised land of an intrinsic value, but how much further a bond will drop if things go wrong, which for a distressed company is quite probable. When reading, the primary aim of the bond buyer must be to avoid trouble and not to protect himself in the event of trouble, you may chuckle. Aren't we already in trouble with distressed companies? Trust me, things can always get uglier. Repeat 100 times until memorized. The purchaser of low-priced bonds is fully aware of the risk he is running. He is more likely to make a thorough investigation of the issue and to appraise carefully the chances of loss and of profit. Finally, most important of all, he is prepared for whatever losses he may sustain, and his profits are in a form available to meet his losses. How, pray, will this purchaser make a thorough investigation? Why, they will look not only at the income statement, but also at the balance sheet. We have expressed our conviction that the balance sheet deserves more attention than Wall Street has been willing to accord it for many years past. I cherish Graham and Dodd's description of the attention that was my work for 20 years, less for their quantitative accuracy than their evocative quality. There are unbounded opportunities for shrewd detective work, for critical comparisons, for discovering and pointing out a state of affairs quite different from that indicated by the publicized per-share earnings. That is the joy of distressed investing as I saw it. The thrilling investigations, the exciting discoveries, the creative and strategic thinking, the creative word again, that deliver unique insights. A corporate indebtedness being a private contract has infinite variations. Even in the well-established U.S. leveraged loan and junk bond markets, there are differences in covenants, seniority, security, callability, sometimes extremely subtle and often highly controversial, that can make the difference between a losing trade and a winning one. As a company slides into trouble, conflicts arise over how to divide the corporate value pie among creditors, be it between secured and unsecured lenders, junior and senior bondholders, revolver and term loan bankers, first lien and second lien creditors, and all of them at once in an epic creditor battle. A good distressed investor is indeed a shrewd detective and a chess master, an army general and a diplomat, studying scenarios, positioning their bets, anticipating each stakeholder's next move. Scores of distressed investments have the twists and turns of the best TV drama, with colorful protagonists and supporting characters, dark hours and hopeful dawns, spells of luck and misfortune, good and bad endings. It's Game of Thrones and your Daenerys, Mother of Dragons. A prescient recommendation from Graham and Dodd is to avoid analyzing the balance sheet or the income statement separately because these can be incomplete and manipulated, focusing instead on their relationship, like pieces of a puzzle that form a corporate picture. 50 years ahead of their time, they foresaw the imperative of the cash flow statement. They also described the frauds and accounting manipulations that led to many of the largest ever corporate bankruptcies around 2001. These, helped along by the telecom and dot-com debacle in the early aughts, launched distressed investing as a lucrative branch of the hedge fund industry. Graham and Dodd insisted that the connection between the financial statements is more informative than the static study of each, highlighting the necessity of relating an analysis of income accounts to an examination of the pertinent balance sheets. Emphasis mine. The meaning of any income statement cannot properly be understood except with reference to the balance sheet at the beginning and at the end of the period. The cash flow statement is the report that neatly links the frozen picture of the balance sheet to the dynamic, but mostly non-cash, manipulable income statement. Not until 1987 did SFAS Statement Number 95 mandate that firms provide a cash flow statement, a disclosure that present-day distressed investors rely on extensively. In the subsequent chapters of the Analysis of the Income Account section, Graham and Dodd proceed to describe accounting tricks and schemes on the income statement, from slightly deceptive to outright fraudulent. The current distressed investor would do well to study them, as those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The prehistory of distressed investing is in there. Manipulation of depreciation reserve? WorldCom is Exhibit A. Padding income by including items in earnings that have no real existence? I give you Global Crossing. Depreciating 609 often an issue in mergers? Ask Tyco. Earnings subject in extraordinary degree to arbitrary determination and manipulation? Here's Enron. I glibly described distressed investing as buying troubled companies' debt, but buying it is only the beginning, not the end game. A phenomenal amount of work is required to achieve a favorable outcome. This debt may be worthless unless and until we manage to clean up the company through a capital restructuring or an operational turnaround, or more likely both. The goal is to make the company viable and profitable again with a sustainable financing plan, thereby increasing the value of its securities. In short, the distressed investor is an activist. That term is often used for shareholders these days, but it is applicable in a bankruptcy to creditors who stand to be the new owners. Our authors devote an entire chapter to stockholders' management relationships, in which they denounce the notorious fact that the typical American stockholder is the most docile and apathetic animal in captivity. They list potential conflicts between shareholders and management, including expansion, compensation, dividend policy, information, even business continuation. They urge action. Alert shareholders will not surrender their right that a corporation should operate in their sole interest. that is music to the distressed investor's ears. It is their job to design and implement a restructuring plan that redresses the issues that led to failure, and collect a hefty return in so doing. Over-leveraged balance sheet, hasty expansion, unprofitable acquisitions, excessive dividends, incompetent management team, all of it needs to be creatively and rigorously addressed in a plan ultimately approved by the bankruptcy judge and creditors. The writers predicted the immense profit potential of the discipline, highlighting discrepancies between prices and values in receivership as obligations sold at a ridiculously low price compared with the current assets available to them. This had previously led us to advise strongly against buying at investment levels any securities of a company that is likely to fall into financial difficulties. It now leads us to suggest that, after these difficulties have arisen, they may produce attractive analytical opportunities. Emphasis their own. Our perceptive duo points out that investors are constitutionally averse to buying into a troubled situation. Not only constitutionally, one might add, but in many cases also institutionally, which confers a formidable edge to the distressed investor able to buy and hold securities that others must dump at inefficient prices. The killer app, what previous generations called a mousetrap, of the book resides under price patterns produced by insolvency. Consider this prophetic sentence. A profitable field of analytical activity should be found, therefore, in keeping in close touch with such situations, endeavoring to discover securities that appear to be selling far under their intrinsic values, and to determine approximately the best time for making a commitment in them. Alas, there is little elaboration on this promising topic. There is no example that considers receivership from the point of view of buying, only from selling or switching, upgrading a portfolio. There is, shockingly, no chapter on distressed analysis in the 800-some pages of the Security Analysis Bible. Why? This omission baffled me until I looked back at the edition dates. Plainly, in the original Graham and Dodd world, there was no adequate process to make money in bankruptcy. Until the 1930s, bankruptcy generally meant liquidation, and bankruptcy courts dealt primarily with foreclosure of a firm's assets, hardly a way to make a profit for a bondholder when, in practice, we find a very definite disinclination on the part of the courts to permit corporate bondholders to take over properties by foreclosing on their liens if there is any possibility that these assets may have a fair value in excess of their claim. However, the Corporate Reorganization Act, followed by the Chandler Act and the Trust Indenture Act of 1939, introduced corporate reorganization rules with the purpose of keeping businesses alive and giving them a chance to emerge rather than dismantling them. While it was obviously a response to the crash of 1929 and the dire economic conditions of the 1930s, the charter of the bill was to be of permanent helpful assistance to distressed corporations, providing the opportunity for amicable adjustment by debtor and creditors under the supervision and protection of the bankruptcy courts, and for holding the property of the debtor intact with its operation disturbed as little as practicable. Bankruptcy, as we know it today, particularly Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code, emerged from the 1978 reform, furthering the goal to maintain corporate operations, save jobs, and attract new sources of credit while freezing pre-petition debt collection until it could be sorted out over time. As described by Professor Charles J. Tabb, a leading bankruptcy scholar, the most often repeated justification for Chapter 11 is to maximize the value of the debtor firm. The operative assumption is that there is a going concern surplus for a reorganized firm over and above its liquidation value. In short, the most fundamental reason for having a corporate rescue procedure such as Chapter 11 is to maximize value for the benefit of all stakeholders in the enterprise. More money is better than less. Voila! Distressed investing could begin in earnest. Graham and Dodd indeed presumed that the process would be beneficial, but The new laws had not yet time to prove their merits or deficiencies in actual practices. Our scribes were, simply put, too early. Nevertheless, they managed to give me a career. It's true. My big breakthrough as an investor finds its origin in security analysis, deep in an obscure section on special types of obligations that describes railroad equipment certificates, bonds secured by title to locomotives, freight, or passenger cars, and by the pledge of the lease under which the railroad is using the equipment. According to our exacting authors, the investment record of these equipment obligations is very satisfactory, particularly because until recently, even the most serious financial difficulties of the issuing road have very rarely prevented the prompt payment of interest and principal. They continue. The holder of the equipment lien can threaten to take the rolling stock away. It is the possession of this alternative which, in practice, has proved of prime value to the owner of equipment trusts. Little did Graham and Dodd know that decades later bankers would ingeniously use this basic structure to finance commercial aircraft. They enhanced it by making EETC bonds, enhanced equipment trust certificates, bankruptcy remote, tranched in senior and junior layers, and strengthened by a liquidity facility that enabled interest payments even if the airline went bankrupt. Thus, EETC bonds were safer than regular airline corporate bonds, rated higher by rating agencies, and purchased by investment-grade investors. Northwest Airlines was the first to issue an EETC in 1994. Gaining widespread acceptance, issuance ballooned to $15 billion as we entered 2001 and promised continued exponential growth. These were bulletproof bonds which could suffer default only under exceptional and highly improbable circumstances. Unfortunately, the exceptional and improbable and tragic did happen. After the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, EETCs plunged in price. The next day, I was tapped to cover the sector. The entire U.S. airline industry teetered on insolvency. Carriers were promptly downgraded, and all but one filed for bankruptcy within 5 years. Aircraft prices cratered. We were in uncharted territory with a new financial instrument that was still untried in a downside scenario, and holders who had been attracted to its safety and investment-grade rating and lacked any mandate or expertise in distressed investing. They stampeded for the exit, forcefully selling for whatever they could get. Suddenly, bonds traded at prices below the value of the aircraft that served as collateral, sometimes even below their scrap value. Under a specific section of the bankruptcy code, bondholders could, as in the old railroad equipment bonds, repossess or threaten to repossess the aircraft, thereby gaining considerable leverage over the estate and other creditors while securing the ability to realize